Hi, everyone. Hi, my name is Mike. We'll do intros in a second. And this is the React Native versus Native app development panel. This is, all of us are members of thoughtbot, which is a product development and design consultancy. We use an agile, human-centered strategy for web and mobile products at every stage. Upfront research, prototyping, user-first design, expert development, ongoing operations, all that jazz. So you know what you're building, optimizing, and maintaining is the best version of itself. If you want to hear more about that, the kind of work we do, check out our website at thoughtbot.com or email us. There's going to be emails shown at the end. All right, so that's who we are. That's who the company is. Hi, I'm Mike Burns. I'm a developer at thoughtbot doing Android and Ruby on Rails. I'm in a management position on a team called Boost, which helps products and teams scale existing products and existing teams. And I'm going to be acting as the moderator and also the panelist. Over to Jason for an introduction.
Hi, I'm Jason Bailey. I'm a thoughtbot product manager, but I was a developer for many years. I started with iOS development, and then I also switched over and did a lot of React Native development. So I can look at it from both those perspectives and also from sort of like leadership team planning perspective.
Toss it over to somebody.
I'll pass it to Lewis.
Hi, everyone. My name is Louis Antonopoulos. I'm an expert mobile developer, and you know that because it says it right there on the slide. Proof. I've been a developer since the iPad days. Recently, I've started dabbling in a little bit of Rails, but I'm here to represent native development. I'm also in a management position on the Liftoff team, which focuses on longer scale MVPs. Steven, bring us home.
Bringing it home. Hi, everybody. My name is Steven Hanson. I am a senior developer and team lead at thoughtbot. My background is mostly in full stack web development, including React. And for the past, 3 or 4 years, I've started doing more and more React Native. So I'm here to kind of represent that transition from web to React Native, and then just to represent React Native more generally in the React Native versus native discussion, which I'm hoping will be called React Native Destroys Native, but that's yet to be determined.
Great intros, everyone. Let's start with some definitions here. What even is React Native? Maybe Jason or Steven wants to answer this.
You can go for it, Steven.
Sure. So React Native was developed by Facebook as a way to build native mobile apps using React. So there's a couple benefits of this approach. One, if you have developers who are already familiar with React, that's the language that you're using to build your mobile app. And two, you can have one code base for your mobile app that builds to multiple different platforms. And I think for the sake of this panel, we're just going to be talking about iOS and Android, even though React Native can build to other platforms.
Thanks for that. Anything you want to add, Jason?
Just to sort of say that even though it uses JavaScript, it's done in a way that's really very like the native phones. It uses like the libraries and actual like sorry, my brain's not working today. It uses like the actual like can somebody pick up for me? I'm sorry.
It actually uses the iOS and Android libraries for rendering the UI, and you're just using JavaScript to control that.
Yeah, so it has a lot of performance benefits over something that would just sort of be a JavaScript rendering engine. So it gets a really close experience to the native apps, even though it's using a single code base.
Good addition. Lewis, do you want to clarify what we mean by native and or directly attack React Native right now? Your choice.
I will reserve my attacks for later.
Good.
But let's see. So native development is when you are creating for a platform in a language and a development environment directly created by those platforms as owners. So in the case of iOS, it's writing most typically today in Swift, although there are certainly some legacy Objective-C. Again, those are both languages. They're created by Apple. You're using Apple's Xcode. And then when you're developing for Android, you're typically writing in Kotlin using Android Studio. So you are closer to you're using the software implementation that was designed by the people who also created the hardware.
Yep. Good. All right, we got some definitions out of the way. Let's get into it. So who even uses these different technologies? Now, obviously, native is used by everyone. React Native uses native under the hood. Google and Apple directly use native. Most of the apps you use are native. When we talk about React Native, what kind of apps are we talking about there?
You talking about like apps that we're familiar with that are built in React Native?
Yeah.
There's a lot of them. There, the biggest and most obvious is Facebook. Instagram as well has some of their app. I don't think Facebook or Instagram are fully React Native apps, but at least portions of them are, or some of their products within the app. You also have Shopify, Skype, I think, Pinterest, Wix. There's a lot of big apps that you would recognize, which I think kind of proves out this question of like, can a successful app with a good experience use React Native?
Mm-hmm. Good answer. What about, sorry, I'm about to adjust my camera. What about, let's like briefly touch on other technologies just to state our expertise, and then perhaps Ionic, Flutter, PhoneGap,
Xamarin.
Anyone have any quick thoughts on these? They're like not the main focus of today's panel, so.
I've built Ionic and more generally like Cordova, PhoneGap apps that are in the App Store, and hands down, they were not good experiences. Those technologies, for those not familiar, are completely web-based. So basically, your entire app is pretty much a web view that has a native wrapper around it, and then then you do have access to some native APIs for things like in-app purchasing and push notifications and stuff. But at the core, those apps are web technology, and I think users of those apps can kind of tell that they're not native, both from a performance perspective and also from a UI perspective. So there's definitely a pretty big phone gap between those technologies and React Native, in my view.
And I will say, as a former Xamarin developer, which uses C# and the Mono platform, I thought that was actually very close to native development, both in like the way the language looked as you were writing it and in the execution on the device. So I find that to be much closer, and I would say probably on par with the React Native experience.
I don't think any of us can talk that much about actually developing in Flutter, but I will say, I think Flutter as an up-and-comer, like you have to consider for you and your project and your organization whether that up-and-coming technology is a great fit. It might be if you love like trying the newest thing out, but I think a few years ago I was like skeptical about React Native. Like will it be successful in the App Store? Will Apple and Android's continue to support it? Will you be able to find developers that want to learn it and know it? I think React Native has matured a lot more now, and it's like a much safer choice. But you're still in a little bit of that like new starting danger territory with Flutter. So like if you're like a big organization or you're looking to hire a team, like you might have a harder time finding Dart developers, or you might not have any on your existing team. So there's just trade-offs like that. But I don't necessarily think it's a bad choice, like for like a small, like maybe your personal project, or like just a couple of founders and they want to learn a new thing and do it the cool new way. That could work. So
Yep, good answer. And when we have experimented with Flutter, we found performance complexities. I hesitate to call them performance issues. What we found was that performance was surprising. And we were able to optimize it after help with existing Flutter and Dart developers at Google. But it was not, we were not able to leverage our existing mobile development knowledge or our even JavaScript development knowledge to help us know how to make it perform on par with even React Native. That was years ago though. So as Jason said, I think that might have been 2 years ago that we last looked at that. So as Jason said, up and coming technology, very experimental. If that's what you want to play with, like, awesome. No complaints there, just know what you're getting into. Stephen, you mentioned users noticing. When it comes to native versus React Native, will users notice what you go with?
More specifically, are you asking about performance or look and feel?
You can go with any answer you want.
My general answer is probably not. For both of those, you know, I imagine we want to kind of dive into both of those. You know, we could start with look and feel. You know, obviously, if you're building an app, you want your Android app to feel like an Android app so that Android users get the experience they expect. And if you're building an iOS app, you want the same thing for your iOS users. I have actually found this to be very easy with React Native to the point where you have to fight against it to a degree to not get that. And let me explain kind of my reasoning here. So when you're talking about the look and feel of your app in terms of that native look and feel, I think there's a few categories to think about. There's your core UI components. So this is like a date picker or a button, even little things like a loading spinner. These text inputs, these core components are mostly provided by React Native itself or community libraries. And these already bridge to the native platforms to provide that native experience. So if you just pull in React Native and use a activity indicator for like a loading state, by default, it will look like kind of one that users have seen on Android and one that users have seen on iOS. So, and similarly with like a date picker or something, that one you'd have to get from a community library, but you can find ones that already have that native experience for both platforms. So that's kind of the first category, is your core UI components. I think it's you typically have to fight against modals is another example. You typically have to fight against the framework to have an experience that doesn't feel like a user would expect. The next category, which I think is a big one, is navigation through your app. This is like going between screens. And I'm also going to lump in like the header on your app, maybe a tab bar. Maybe you got like a little side drawer with a hamburger menu or something like that. So this is where like your app can really not feel native, is if it doesn't behave like a user would expect. So like on iOS, for example, you go to the next screen, you expect a little left to right transition to go to that next screen. And when you go back, you expect a right to left. On Android, you might expect this like stack in animation and stack out. Once again, this is where the library handles almost all of that for you. So there is no navigation library built into React Native, but there are two very popular navigation libraries that almost everybody uses. One that is probably far and away the most popular, called React Navigation. This handles all of that for you out of the box. You're going to get the animations that look right on Android and iOS. Similarly, it also includes components for like the header bar, tab bar, all of that kind of stuff. And it's also out of the box styled like you would expect. Like on Android, you got a header on the left. The header is centered on iOS with different spacing. Maybe you have a line under it on one platform versus another. Little things like that. So once again, you have to fight the framework to, and a lot of people do. So I mean, I'm not saying this is something that doesn't happen and that is a problem, but you have to fight the framework to get an experience where you're like in an Android app and you're like, this feels like an iOS app. This isn't what I expect. And then the final category, I know I'm talking for a while, but the final category would be like truly custom components. And this is where, you know, if you say, I want to make my own I don't know, option picker, you know, you pick an option from a list. Typically you don't want to do that, but if you do, that's where you really need to know the platforms you're developing for and make sure. There's a lot of other areas where you need to know your platforms you're developing for, but in terms of UI, this in particular is where you really need to know what a user would expect on each platform. But I found that I very rarely need to create core, you know, foundational components that typically have like a strong association with a certain platform from scratch. Rebuttal.
more like a collaborative response. Yeah, so I think it's interesting. I think what you highlighted are truly where I've noticed the differences between React Native and native apps. It's in those fundamental things: the tab bar, the navigation, individual buttons, the animations throughout. Over time, I know I've definitely had my thoughts like shift on this, and where I sort of stand now is it speaks more to the amount of mobile experience that the development team has as opposed to either of the individual tools. I've certainly seen, like, if you are just a JavaScript developer, you've never worked in mobile, I think there's high probability you're going to create an app that doesn't feel like a mobile app. The same though can be said if you're an inexperienced iOS or Android developer. Like there is work even within the native platform to make it feel like a native app, like a polished native app is maybe a better way to say it. I think, and this is maybe the rebuttal part, I think there's a larger room for error in React Native versus when using the native tools, because the native tools are supposed to get you like 90% of the way there versus how you customize them. And one of the things that I experienced again, I've just dabbled in React Native, so I'm definitely not an expert. One of the things you said was, there are two main choices for navigation. And that to me is one of the biggest differences between React Native and native, is that in React Native, you often have choices. You have choices about which one of those two are you going to pick. And that carries through a lot of components, through a lot of things. Whereas when you're purely working on native development, there's typically like one primary path, and like you don't really deviate from that as much. So I find that there's a little more room for error. All that said, again, just to bring it back, the experience of the mobile development team that's working on it is going to identify those things regardless of which tool set they're working with.
Yeah, and as an Android user, I can say that I often feel that React Native apps are built by iOS users. And certainly at thoughtbot, I think we've done a good job of not falling into that trap. But a lot of apps I use, I'm like, oh, this was built by an iOS developer and then compiled to Android. The navigation, the lack of the floating action bar, which is an Android specific UI component. The assumptions of what, like some apps will add their own back button to the top left corner, which is very much an iOS thing. And you're probably right, Stephen, that they had to do that manually. And it sort of goes to what Lewis is saying as well, of like if they're an inexperienced mobile developer, they're simply not going to know how to make an Android app if they don't know Android development. And this might be actually an ad for React Native, right? That like you can make an iOS app and also compile it to Android, and now you get two apps for the price of one.
I do
close to the price of one.
I think it's really common for React Native teams to just sort of build on one platform and then see if it works on the other platform. It's like important, something we've learned that you should make sure that you're compiling and testing and dog fooding, and some people are looking at one and the other people are looking at the other, like all throughout the development, design, and everything. Otherwise, you do end up with that situation.
And I would add, like, I completely agree with the importance of somebody on the team needs to be familiar with each platform. I don't think it has to be the developer. Imagine building a web app and like you're not a web user. It's like, no, you wouldn't really know what to do. I think ideally you have a developer on the team who's familiar with Android and a developer who's familiar with iOS. I think the second best is you at least have a designer or a product person, or at least a tester, somebody with input who is familiar with that core platform. What I see a lot though with like smaller startup projects that we do is there really isn't an Android user or expert on some projects that we're on, and that's kind of where things start to get difficult.
Great answers. I'm going to move on. There's also a question in the chat. I want to make sure we get to it after this next round of questions, which is around security and privacy. I'm also going to throw HIPAA and PHI and PII. I can expand those acronyms if people actually want me to. Either way, security and privacy. Does it matter with these different platforms? Is there a noticeable change? Anyone want to address this?
Remember left pad? So a React Native app is going to use a lot of community third-party packages. So I mean, you are introducing, anytime you use external code, open source code, you are opening the door more to vulnerabilities. If a package gets compromised in some way, that could open the door for a vulnerability in your app. So I would say that's a hit against React Native.
Well, there is the pro open source argument to make that lots of people have looked at these libraries and are trying to catch the bugs in them. So hopefully you find that out soon.
Did you see?
Sure, although, I mean, there have been some cleverly crafted attacks where someone registers like a package with a slightly misspelled name, and you think you're getting the official one, and what you're getting is not. There's definitely some to be said about that. Certainly, like within native development, like you could do it without any external dependencies. Most of the projects I've been on have brought in something else, either through like CocoaPods or Carthage, which are third-party libraries for managing certain features to make it easier to develop. So you have some of the same, but yeah, when you start a React Native project, like all the stuff that gets imported, it's a lot. But at the same time, that's everything that gets imported when you start a web project, right? Like all that's happening. So if you have a website, in some ways, you already have that vulnerability.
Did you see, this is like very off topic, but I'm excited about security. Did you see the announcement this week that it turns out NPM has had a bug for years? They don't know for how long, that allowed an attacker to just register any package and upload any package they wanted to anyone else's account. That was a good one. Yeah,
I'm gonna go off camera for a while and just sob quietly in the corner.
I do think it is concerning how it feels like there's been a JavaScript exploit or a JavaScript package exploit maybe every 3 weeks for the past few months, which is to a degree that I don't hear about in the native development world. And I agree with what Lewis said, that I bring in very few third-party packages. I'll bring in a payment processor library, maybe exactly one Vue library, and that's maybe it. Otherwise, it's just stuff from Google for me. So that is one aspect when it comes to security and privacy. How do we feel about upgrades? And by that, I mean upgrading the libraries, upgrading React Native, upgrading the native libraries. Is that something that we do? Is that something that's straightforward?
I did it this week, so I can talk to it. So I'm working on a React Native app right now. I was in React Native 0.64, and I needed to upgrade to the latest 0.66 to get support for bug fixes for iOS 15, and so that I could build the app. Basically, every time Xcode releases a new version, you typically have to update React Native, which is a good nudge, that is already needed. So Android's a little easier in that regard, but so I did that this week. It took me mostly an afternoon. It was about an afternoon to update. So I was on the version of React Native I was on was about 6 months old. And I updated React Native and every single package in the project because I thought we're already going to regression test the whole app. Might as well just upgrade everything. It's actually pretty smooth. I've definitely heard horror stories with React Native upgrades, and I've experienced a few. There's definitely like a whack-a-mole of bugs that occupied a couple hours of like, oh, I updated React Native 66. This dependency, I need to upgrade that too, because it only supports up to React Native 64, et cetera. So that's kind of why I like to upgrade everything at the same time. The goal is to be on the latest anyway. So with that approach, I felt like it went pretty smoothly. But basically React Native provides what they call an upgrade helper, which gives you the exact diff you need to upgrade your entire app from version A to version B. The diff is specific to the from and to versions. So they make it pretty easy in that regard, but then it's just a matter of going through all your packages and making sure you're on the right version of third-party packages as well.
For me, this is one that represents a clearer, like an easier win for native development, because if you do the native stuff gets upgraded, you have to update that and everything else in React Native. Versus on the native side, and again, speaking purely for iOS, you're like, sure, there are major Xcode versions and major iOS versions. Because of the compiler type safety, like, if something doesn't build, because we tend not to bring in a lot of third-party dependencies, you much less frequently have major conflicts. Like on the projects I've been on, we've updated pretty regularly, at least once a month, like all our dependencies. And the biggest things I've run into is like, we tend to use GraphQL a lot. And so the Apollo iOS, like that's been the biggest source of conflicts and what do we need to change. So to me, it's a nicer, it's an easier experience in native development when you're doing upgrades.
Yeah, I'll add that it throws a big wrench in a project. Basically, anytime Xcode releases a new version, if you want to be able to build with that, say your development machine upgraded, you have to upgrade React Native, which doesn't always fit exactly into the timeline of a project, right? Like I didn't want to do the upgrade in the middle of this week, and my Xcode auto updated. So I was like, I guess I'm doing that upgrade. So like that's a real annoyance, I would say, but also it kind of forces you to stay up to date. So that's also a plus in my book.
You can run older versions of Xcode. You can have them both if you need to.
Yeah, that's true. We needed to do this anyway, so I just did it.
But speaking of Xcode and also the Android Studio, when I have to do upgrades, it's sort of baked into Android Studio that like things are marked as deprecated. I can go find all of them and do the upgrade. I need to upgrade from this version to that version. So I'll go like to the patch release, and that will highlight all the deprecations and allow me to do a more seamless upgrade there. And so that is sort of like a nice feature. So what we're getting at here is like the native platform is built for upgrades, and then React Native is chasing after those upgrades. And that is like a complexity where, the React Native is not officially supported by Google or Apple. We can think of things that were too big to fail that were also not officially supported by Google or Apple, such as Flash. If you go with React Native, are you really like, how secure is that in terms of the future?
Is that a question or an observation?
I guess we don't have an answer, do we?
I mean, I was nervous about React Native when I first started working with it, but I've gotten a lot more comfortable with it. It's just, yeah, I mean, like you said, there's the too big to fail problem, but so many apps are using it, and the workflow is really straightforward, and yeah, just a lot of user community out there using it.
Is there any risk of an app being rejected from the App Store due to React Native?
I would say no, because you're writing the app in JavaScript, but your code base has an iOS directory and an Android directory, which are real native projects. So like, you're writing your source code in JavaScript, but you're doing you have an actual iOS project that you can open in Xcode and Android Studio for Android. The real projects, they just happen to leverage a JavaScript bundle as well and run a JavaScript thread while the native app is running. So I would say from the Apple is the more stringent reviewer, so particularly like from their perspective, I've never had an issue with it. And you know, you got Facebook and Instagram using them. Like I don't think I haven't noticed that being a problem.
Yeah, I think it's more just your traditional reasons you might be rejected, no matter what the app was written in.
All right, that's good to hear. All right, we're gonna get a little closer to the developer side of things, but first off, what does it cost to make these apps? What does it cost
$1
to make an
million.
app? Okay, well, maybe another phrasing is, what do you get for $1 million if you go React Native versus native?
It's a hard question because there's so many things to factor in. I think part of there's a couple of value propositions of React Native that come into play. So one is that it uses web technology. So if you have folks on your team that already know React, or you have developers or designers who are familiar with CSS, because React Native it has its own styling system, which is based on CSS, which is very familiar to any web developer. You can leverage you know, some of your existing team, which could be a cost saving technique. Additionally, you have one code base. So I consider this to be probably the primary area that you get cost savings. In my React Native projects, we have a project management tool, and we don't have tasks on that tool that are iOS, do this. Yeah, iOS implement a setting screen. Android implement setting screen. We have one task, and we do it one time. You know, we go in, we hook up the API. We have our business logic. We even build our screen, and we do it one time. And then we're running that app in the iOS emulator and the Android emulator while we do it. But it's one effort. It's not two separate tasks in a project management tool, and that's where the biggest cost savings come in.
Yeah, I think more than even just cost savings, it's like what does a functioning team look like in your organization? How far can you spread your resources out and it makes sense? Like, would you rather have you know, four web developers, 2 iOS developers, and 2 Android developers, but like, you know, so you just end up with like stratified problems, like only these 2 people can work on this set of problems. If they take vacation, like that car's not driving that week, you get out of sync really easily. Whereas if you've got, you know, instead you just have 8 programmers and they can all work on any aspect of the projects you've got going on, you know, your 2 websites and your one app or whatever it is. It can just be easier. Like, somebody took vacation, somebody left the company, they didn't take all the knowledge of that app with them. Everybody can work on it. It can just make sense in certain organizations.
Mike, one of the things I think makes it hard to answer the question is, and this is a realization that's come to me recently, is like, it's hard to even quantify how long it takes to write a feature in any given language, right? Like, you pick anything or any set of features you're trying to develop, it's going to take a certain amount to write it in Swift. It's going to take a certain amount to write it in Kotlin, and another certain amount to write it in React Native. I think unless you're the developer that is equally familiar in all 3 technologies, and you sit down and you implement the whole thing 3 times, like, it's hard to get hard numbers on, like, are you truly getting 2 for 1 or not? One of our developers, Rakesh, maintains that yes, that he's seen like over large projects where that it sort of averages out over time, that you get close to the 2 for 1 benefit. But again, I think it's really hard to quantify, just because software development isn't like, it's an art, right? It takes different amounts of time, and it's really hard to quantify how long will this feature take or this set of features take.
But you do automatically get feature parity, which I have seen, like where they have, you know, a web app and an iOS app and an Android app, and they're all 3 very out of sync in what they offer the users, and it can just be a tough problem. So you do avoid, like, whether you got there faster than like one of the 3 separate options might have gotten, you do at least stay on track with each other.
You mentioned, it's been mentioned a couple times, going from web to React Native, or going from blah, 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 blah. What is involved in going from React to React Native?
I could speak to this one, having done it. I think it's worth making the distinction of, like, are you the like senior like the lead developer on this project, or are you working alongside someone with mobile experience? So what I've found is a React developer can jump into a React Native app and be productive pretty much immediately. It's just React. It is a React development experience. It's using, the same framework, library that web developers used to. And I've mentioned before that the styling is even basically CSS. It's a a recreation of CSS. So yes, a React developer can help out on a React Native app. I've found that to be true without any sort of formal training or long ramp up. Now, can the transition from web developer to I'm the lead, mobile developer on a project is a lot more difficult than I've seen some people. I spent some time just like assuming that was like a real, discounting the amount of domain knowledge a mobile developer has. There's a lot to know. It's nothing like web. You have, you have complex navigation stacks with different stacks based on tabs and drawers and things like that. That's difficult. You have lots of native capabilities like in-app purchases, push notifications, interacting with device hardware, password managers, all of that kind of stuff that you don't know about if you're just coming from web. You might not even know those things exist to be able to help your team know what can be done. And then on top of all of that, you have the app stores themselves and releases, build management, testing internally, externally, and then finally the review and release process, which is along with profiles and certificates and all kinds of stuff that comes along with that. So yeah, there's a lot of mobile specific and platform specific knowledge that there is a pretty big ramp up. But as long as you have at least someone on the team that knows those things, then yes, a React developer can come in and make progress.
Yeah, that's a real good point. I feel like it's important to note that the JavaScript is not the hard part. It's just the syntax, and you could easily if you can learn JavaScript, you could in theory also learn Kotlin or Swift or whatever. It's the actual concepts. Actually, I don't know. As an Android developer, I don't actually know this answer. When you're looking up documentation on how to do various things in React Native, are you encountering Java and Objective-C or Kotlin and Swift in the process?
The answer is generally no, or almost always no. But what I have found is that a knowledge of the, I have found this and actually don't possess this, knowledge of the underlying native platform is extremely helpful. So like one example of this is accessibility. So like React Native provides accessibility APIs with accessibility label, accessibility hint, accessibility state. These are all things, role. These are all things that you can annotate your components with. React Native itself provides very little documentation on like what's the proper way to use these. But once you know that accessibility hint just maps to the iOS accessibility hint, then you know that you can find documentation from the native, from the native platform. And then if you know how it maps to Android, you can find documentation there. So there's a lot of instances like that. Text inputs have all kinds of properties like text content type, which maps to an iOS property, and autocomplete type, which maps to an Android property. If you know how these map, then you know how to use them better. And it's not always clear with React Native.
To support what both of you are saying, I find that greater indication of success is not the tool set but mobile experience. So if you took a whole bunch of Android, Kotlin developers and iOS Swift developers, and you said, go work on a mobile project and you have to use React Native and you've never done it before, I think that's going to be more successful than a team that doesn't have the mobile experience. And same in the other direction. And that goes like sort of knowing where to look for things, knowing how things are supposed to work, knowing how things are supposed to feel when you use the app. That mobile experience to me sort of is the overarching decider of, is this project going to be more successful or not?
There's a question in the chat I want to get to now, which is, how would you rate the developer experience of each platform coming from a non-web experience? I clicked a button in Zoom. I don't know what that does.
It says you're going to answer live, so go.
All right, here we are. And so, I mean, Louis, you just answered, if, coming from iOS or Android going to React Native, that seems pretty smooth. You're basically learning new syntax for the techniques you use. We could also take the example of coming out of university with a computer science degree, and I don't know, I'm not close enough to university age. I don't know what computer science degree gives you these days.
I'd like to answer this in the most biased way possible.
Please.
And so this comes down now to developer preference. So having recently been on a project where the mobile aspect was written in React Native, I had the opportunity to, review the pull requests and see what the code was like, and not just in like a playground app or a me learning on my own, but in a real, like, this is live. And, to be honest, I hated it. I absolutely hated it. But that doesn't speak to React Native. That speaks to like the JavaScript, just the way this, like looking at the CSS diffs, it was much harder for me, where I felt like I was like, okay, I trust you. And I know there's comparable things, like when you're looking at a nib file in, iOS development. So I'm just like, all right, there's a whole lot of XML there. I guess it's going to work. But still, I just felt much more comfortable looking at like Swift PRs than looking at React Native PRs. So again, that is a fully biased. If you love JavaScript, you might hate iOS development and be like, no, React Native makes much more sense to me. So take it away, other people.
I do have to provide a counterpoint that you haven't truly not lived until you've reviewed like project.pdxproj and storyboard and info.plist diffs.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I couldn't disagree more. But again, we're both biased by having our experience in different platforms.
I've done both. So I hated React Native when I started it, but now it's fine and comfortable. I think that native developers, feel free to kind of contradict me, but like I feel like native development is more like PC system hardware, like actual software, like app development on a computer. It's got more of a tool set around like providing you your views and everything, and a really good IDE that's like made for just writing that type of software, and it's a little bit more low level, and it's thinking about how you're using the resources that you're connected to, and I think that React Native is more like web development with CSS and a little bit more abstracted from the underlying system. So I don't think that there's a better or worse. I think it's like, what is your like experience in like what's more comfortable to you?
I agree with this, and I assume you were complimenting native while saying this. And like an important part of this is I can go lower level while writing Kotlin as I need to. If there's like a performance bottleneck, I can figure that out. Like the performance bottleneck is in the JVM somewhere, and I'm already in the JVM. And if I need to integrate some C++, I can throw the NDK at this and get like an actual, like more low level integration. And I'm sure I can do that in React Native as well, but it's like part of the development process while writing a native Android app to be able to inspect and debug and deal with those lower level things. I do want to I'm like, as someone who's also done operating system development, I'm not doing that when I write an Android app. I am doing app level development, but you are right, I'm not doing web level development. I am conscious of the fact that there's a battery in the device that I'm making an app for. So it is something in between.
One of the other things that I do really enjoy for like native iOS development is the extreme amount of type safety that is within the development environment. Like if I refactor something, whether it's me rewriting something or bringing in a new library or updating a library, like I know before I even hit the build button that things are going to be broken, and I know if I hit that build button, I'll find everything that's going to be broken, and I don't have to do as many text search and replaces, and essentially like, well, where else might this have changed? Where something will sort of tend to fail more silently in JavaScript, whether that's like something not being initialized or not having the right type when you expect it. I know that TypeScript, I've heard people describe TypeScript as solving a lot of these problems. I still feel that like the native development experience of type safety makes it much easier for me to feel confident about the non-crashiness of my app.
I would agree and disagree at the same time. I do use TypeScript for all of my React or React Native projects. All of the libraries I use, have TypeScript typings as well. So if I try to pass a property, so whenever I upgraded React Native, for example, I was passing autocomplete type to all of my text inputs. Well, the latest React Native renamed that property to autocomplete. This is a property that maps to Android. I had compile errors. I knew before trying to run it that I needed to rename those. So, we do have that type safety. It's in the JavaScript layer, which is where you're writing the vast majority of your code, if not even all of it for some apps. But where I have the reason I also agree with you is there can be issues with, one issue I found was in Xcode, I had the minimum iOS target as iOS 10, but my React Native version expected it to be 11. So there was some type missing. So whenever I went to try to build, I was getting some errors that did not surface at compile time. So yeah, I think because of that abstraction layer, you do miss some of the native errors that might be lurking, though you find the majority of them in the JavaScript layer.
An additional thing on top of type safety is the static analysis that can come from, in my case, Android Studio, knowing that I'm making an Android app. If I'm using an Android view is some XML. If I use a view library that has no performance problems or could be written in a better way, Android Studio will tell me that. If I'm curious about how a part of the lifecycle is used in the app lifecycle, or how, whether I should override it or in which order, Android Studio tells me that. Sort of the cheat is I never learned Kotlin. I just booted Android Studio with my Java Android knowledge and clicked around until I got a Kotlin app made. So Android Studio held my hand the entire time. And so in terms of like going from not knowing much to building an app, I think Android Studio helps a substantial amount because it knows Android.
I think it's a good point. And the only thing I would add for React Native is the React Native developer experience is a React developer experience, which is basically like the React development experience is proven very widely as, I would say it's generally considered to be a really good experience. What you don't get is like UI tools. You're not visually dragging and dropping to build your views, like that sort of thing. You're building your app in the same way that you would build a web app, which is you write it and you have fast refresh. So like your simulator or emulator is updating automatically as you write it.
We have 1 minute before I'm going to make you all wrap up. So Louis, you wanted to get to business choice. I would like to get to hiring. Let's do both ASAP. Let's start with business choice. Louis, you want to start?
Yeah, certainly. So shameless self-promotion. I have a blog post on our blog about why you shouldn't build a mobile app. And it talks about the expense of building mobile and ultimately what you're trying to get out of your end users, like how you're trying to get them to engage with your platform. One of the things I feel, one of the differentiating choice, like as a business owner, which one do I choose of these? We've talked a lot about technology, but which one do I choose for my business? That's a harder question. It does have a lot to do with where are you in your business life cycle, how much runway you have, how much money, how important mobile is to your overall success, and all these things figure in. I certainly think you can find success with either platform. It just really depends. For me, if I do have more money and I absolutely want to make sure mobile succeeds, I'm going to choose native every time, even if it is more expensive. And again, that does have some personal bias in it. For a lot of early stage founders, though, it's the wrong choice. You don't want to hire two teams, as Jason pointed out. You might not have that. Skill set, as part of your team already, or not want to hire for it. When you're trying to get something out quickly, and I think one of the things we talked about is like it's faster to do it in React Native. You will get a working app out there, both architectures faster. So those are my rapid thoughts on the two.
You'll get both apps out there, but I contend that the time to market of anything at all is faster for React Native, and the time to market for a high gloss, beautiful, reduced bug, high performance app is the same. And sort of like you could plod along making a native app, or you could make a React Native app and get it to be equivalent to the native app in the same amount of time. That's my claim.
I probably don't see that the same way. I think it depends. Like if the product you're trying to build is like an absolutely like groundbreaking experience with 60 frames per second everywhere, animations that are brilliant. I think I do agree. I think that you're probably going to be best served by going straight into native. But I think for a lot of apps, probably most apps, performance with React Native will be great, especially on an early stage company. And time to market for a functional, good MVP plus, much better than MVP product. I still feel like would be faster and cheaper with React Native, but just my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there are reasons to use native, but I think that there's a lot of startups that would really benefit from going with React Native. And I think navigating like why should you make that choice is something that you really should reach out to experts for help with. But some of the reasons that I would pick React Native for a lot of cases is just that quick to like if you're trying to get your product out and get that MVP out and see what kind of traction you've got, you're going to get it in the hands of both the iOS and the Android users really quickly, and then you can start to make your decisions about what's going to happen next. And then like you probably already have some web team or a website that's part of this project, and so there's your small little startup core team can participate in both parts of your business with your mobile app and your web app. And then if you get into the point where like some particular part of your app needs that like super tight experience, you can do that part of your app as a native module and bridge it in, so you can have an iOS or an Android specialist like build that one image rotator screen or whatever needs to be done at the really high fidelity. And you could do it later, part of the project. It doesn't, you don't have to never get to that level of awesome slickness with your React Native app, unless it really is that the whole app has to be this brilliant native experience. So those are my thoughts.
Let's say a company had a React Native team and they wanted to bring in an Android or iOS expert. Do you recommend any?
Well, I'm sitting across the Zoom screen from a couple of really great ones.
I heard Lewis is an expert.
All right, I feel like this also touched on hiring. We're running out of time, so I'm gonna make you all wrap up. Do we agree on anything?
I
It
think we
sounds to
agree
me
there's
like
a
we
place
agree on
in
a
the
lot.
world
Yeah.
put for both. That there's some place where the decision's made, like which should you use, but we don't think that we all think that there's like some place for all solutions, I think.
I think we also all agree that I don't think any of us would be like, oh my God, horrible mistake if you chose the other side, right? It's not that far apart. There are definite gives and takes to all things. I mean, I think we do all agree, like it is, I think, and Mike, you were talking about this, like, from a basic get something out there, it has to be faster for React Native to get something in front of people. Like not looking at quality or animations or anything, just something out there to prove out your idea, which in many cases is the most important thing to do. Find out, do you have a market? Do you have users? Users will tolerate, again, unless, as Jason said, like the whole experience is about this high gloss, high feel. Like if you're you're trying to sell widgets, like people will look over things, especially like we're building something new. People will look past that if they believe in the underlying business. And that, I think we all agree, is the most important thing. Get your idea out there, try it in front of people, get feedback and iterate.
Yeah, I don't disagree. All that said, try building an Android or iOS app in the native language. It's pretty fun. In Android, it's free, and you might find it to be more fun than React Native. That's up to you. We have like 3 minutes left. If you have more questions, drop them in the Q&A. Otherwise, we're going to continue to make fun of each other's sides.
I can add to, we were just talking about, neither decision is the wrong decision, right? You can build a pure native app, you can build a React Native app. There are case studies that you can find of companies that have switched from React Native to native and vice versa. So, there's some research, there's some really good reading out there to discover more around what influenced those decisions. The Airbnb blog post from a few years ago comes to mind. They had an app that used React Native and native, and they decided to switch to fully native. So like that's one example that you can look up and see kind of what influence they're thinking there. And then there's actually some that are the other way around as well.
Right, and the thing that comes to when someone talks about switching like that is, are they laying people off? And that is like, I don't want you to think ahead of time of too far ahead on your product. Your startup might fail. But if you are choosing a technology with the plan of laying people off, that's a thing to consider.
A bad thing. That's a very bad thing. And I think that goes back to what I was saying about, like, I think the having mobile experience, whether it's in one platform or the other, and transferring it is way more viable. But then even more important is the domain experience of your team having built the app, knowing why things are the way they are, knowing where you want to get to. I think it's entirely possible to say, we're going to start in one, we're going to switch to the other later. There's always growing pains, but you can surmount them and your developers will be better. One of the developers I respect the most that I got to work with is expert on both sides. And I was surprised because I expected him to have a strong opinion either way. And he was like, no, I love both. And he's created great apps in both platforms. So your teams can transition.
Yeah, the only other thing I'd throw in there is, like, I don't know that people are really saying, I'm going to start off in React Native and we're going to just rewrite it all in native in a couple of years. Like, I don't think that's the plan. I think way down the line, maybe you've reached the scale of Airbnb and you decide it makes sense. But at that point, maybe you're transitioning that way and you have been for years.
Thank you for that. We are at time. So I'd like to thank everyone who attended, everyone who asked questions. And if you'd like to reach out to us, our personal emails are here. If you're interested in hiring thoughtbot for any part of your process, email hello@thoughtbot.com, and we'll see you on the internet.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.